Yes, do not adjust your ears. It is an edition of Mooney Goes Wild, but we are staying with the coverage of the death of Pope Francis announced in Rome this morning. We're going to talk now to former Archbishop Dermot Martin. Good morning, Archbishop. How are you? Very sad news this morning and for the Catholic Church.
I'm personally just very shocked.
Yes.
And accessories. Curry's has you.
A new special will follow here on RT1 television this morning. For now, more from Drew.
Look at those movies, feel like, because I go, well, that's where he comes from, though. Even though we're here, he has to feel like we know that that's the guy, the private detective from that era, who's now getting older and trying to sort of live a quieter life.
Well, speaking of private detective, I would love to play a...
Like 15 minutes into the reading when he wasn't validating anything, I was like, dude, like you either have this or you don't have this.
Yeah.
And then all he said to me was, so the woman upstairs has your information, and if ever I need to call upon you, you will make yourself available.
Radio Television, tá sé bheag brathnú RTE1 on Luan Cosca Shop. We now interrupt this programme to join David McCullough in the newsroom for an RTE News Special.
/culture.
This is a new era for Europeans, an era of interconnection, where geopolitics and economy are inseparable. Innovation meets disruption, and uncertainty meets never.
Good morning. You're very welcome to this special programme to mark the death this morning of Pope Francis. The Pontiff passed away shortly after 7:30 Roman time, 6:30 here in Ireland. And we can see now the scene in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. On behalf of the Vatican, Cardinal Kevin Farrell announced this morning that Pope Francis had returned to the house of the Father. He was 88 and had been seriously ill in recent months with pneumonia. Just yesterday, he made a brief public appearance in St. Peter's Square to mark Easter Sunday. Here at home, President Higgins spoke of Pope Francis's presentation of his papacy with a unique humility and of how he sought to show in the most striking and moving of ways the extraordinary importance of the spiritual as a powerful source of global ethics in the challenges of contemporary life. Taoiseach Micheál Martin said he had shown an unwavering commitment to the principles of compassion, peace and human dignity. Taoiseach Sir Simon Harris said he was a remarkable figure who embodied compassion, humility and service. While Sinn Féin leader Mary Lou McDonald said he was a courageous spiritual leader, a man of strong conviction who stood up for those most marginalised and vulnerable. Well, first this morning, let's cross over to Rome and speak to journalist Paddy Agnew. Good morning, Paddy. Thanks indeed for joining us. How was that news broken this morning?
David, good morning to you and to all our listeners. It was broken as the Vatican does by its own media machine. And there was, of course, an Irish interest in that because it's the Camerlengo, the Chamberlain, Cardinal, who is Kevin Farrell, and he actually releases the news and says that the Pope has died.
And very sad news, obviously, Paddy, but not obviously unexpected given his illness in recent years.
No. Well, to be fair to Pope Francis, he's been very healthy throughout most of this pontificate. The last 3 years have been admittedly very difficult for him, but you can't say it wasn't like the long and lingering period we had with John Paul II. And his death now, after he was recovered in February, mid-February, doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. I think most of us thought that it's remarkably survived this far. We didn't expect him to get to Christmas.
Yeah, and he did make an appearance yesterday, Paddy, to mark Easter Sunday.
Yes, he did, as he has been doing in the last week. And he's given people the illusion that he's getting better and better all the time. And he would turn up at the end of various Vatican celebrations and give his blessing in a very weak and very tired voice. And he didn't, on any of these occasions, look particularly well, and he certainly didn't look terribly well yesterday.
No, indeed.
And even though he was able to.
Yeah. And Paddy, what happens next? What's the next steps?
Well, there's the period of mourning, and within 5 days, there'll be 9 days. He's will be buried. There'll be the funeral mass.
And Paddy, just before I let you go, because I know you're anxious to get down to St. Peter's Square yourself, just before I let you go, what do you view Francis's legacy as? How will that be seen by the world?
Oh, I think he'll be known as the great reformer. He'd be known as the person who, after 35 years of Benedict and John Paul II, somewhat changed the direction, the whole feel of the Vatican's way of preaching to the world. But it's important to say as well that even though he was a great reformer, his reforms were very much more pastoral than doctrinal. In other words, he didn't change anything outrageous in Vatican teaching, church teaching. We didn't have women priests, we didn't have married priests, etc., etc. But we had a very different approach from the church, a much more welcoming approach to the faithful.
OK. Paddy Agnew, Rome-based journalist, I will let you go now because I know you're anxious to get down to St. Peter's Square, but thank you very much indeed for joining us on this programme.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pope Francis was elected in March 2013, becoming the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Our religion and social affairs correspondent Alva Keneally has been looking back at the life of Pope Francis.
Buonasera.
From the outset, he was Francis the Informal, asking those who cheered his election to bless him before he blessed them. Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio called himself after the radical St. Francis, serving notice that reforms were in store. He rejected the traditional lavish papal apartment and appointed a council of 8 cardinals from around the globe to restructure the Vatican administration and tackle corruption. They began by closing questionable accounts in the Vatican Bank. He broke new ground by establishing a commission on child protection which included survivor advocates like the Irishwoman Mary Collins, but she resigned 3 years later over a failure by a Vatican department to comply with a recommendation that all correspondence from victims and survivors should receive a response. On his first trip outside of Rome, Pope Francis visited Lampedusa as the migrant crisis swept across the Mediterranean. And he horrified traditionalists by washing the feet of women and Muslims during his first Holy Week ceremony as Pope. When asked about homosexuality at the beginning of his papacy, he said, "Who am I to judge?" He later approved blessings for same-sex couples and signed a Doctrine Office document allowing transgender people to be baptised and serve as godparents. But in latter years, he had to apologise for using extremely derogatory language about gay men. Many highlighted his closeness to the poor, whether it was in developed countries, in the third world, or where the two meet, for example in refugee camps in Greece. His appointments of bishops and cardinals favoured both developing nations and newer perspectives, promoting many people from the margins despite the tightly regimented hierarchy handed down to him by his predecessors. His teaching document on the environment, Laudato Si', influenced the World Climate Summit in Paris in 2015, calling on the human family to defend Mother Earth. In the summer of 2018, he visited Ireland as part of the World Meeting of Families, where he was confronted with the controversy surrounding mother and baby homes. He said he hoped his visit would help grow unity and reconciliation among Christians on the island of Ireland. During a mass in the Phoenix Park, he asked for forgiveness. 2 years later, as the world grappled with the impact of COVID-19, places of worship worldwide were forced to close, including Catholic churches. Pope Francis used the global pandemic to reiterate the central message of his papacy, calling for an end to the pandemic of poverty worldwide. He also announced a synod on synodality in the Catholic Church, offering Catholics worldwide a say in the nature and future of their church. It resulted in proposals for church renewal, including the expansion of women's leadership roles, greater lay participation in decision-making and structural reforms. In March 2021, at the age of 84, the pontiff made an unprecedented visit to Iraq under tight security in an effort to offer hope to Iraq's minority Christian community. In one of the most significant moments of the trip, Pope Francis met Iraq's Shia leader, the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. On a visit to Canada in 2022, Pope Francis apologised to Indigenous communities for the abuse they suffered at residential Catholic schools, which were in existence from the late 1800s to the 1990s. He used a wheelchair due to strained knee ligaments and acknowledged that his week-long Canadian pilgrimage was a test that showed he needed to slow down and one day possibly retire. The Pope's predecessor, Emeritus Pope Benedict, opened a path to resignation and remained on Vatican grounds until he passed away on New Year's Eve in 2022. Pope Francis presided over the funeral in a unique ceremony which was carefully organised by the Vatican. As wars raged in Ukraine and Gaza, Pope Francis continuously called for peace. And the year 2025 marked a jubilee year for the Catholic Church, the Jubilee of Hope. In February, the Pope wrote to US bishops to express his condemnation of mass deportations by the Trump administration, calling on those bishops to walk together to defend the human dignity of the migrants in their country. In his effort to reform the social and economic policies of the Vatican, Pope Francis had his critics. But he was greatly admired by people of all faiths worldwide. A man of the people, he'll be remembered for his courage, his compassion and his humility.
Alva Keneally there, and humility is a word I suspect we'll be hearing a lot this morning. We're joined by Michael Kelly, former editor of the Irish Catholic. Michael, good morning. Thank you indeed for joining us. That word humility keeps coming up, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think back to when I saw him yesterday on the balcony of St. Peter's giving the Urbi et Orbi blessing. My mind immediately went back to March 2013 when he came out on the balcony first and he was dressed in that simple white and he said to the crowd, you know, in a very, very charming fashion, Buonasera, good evening. And I think that humility did mark the man. He wasn't someone who found some of the trappings that came with the papacy easy. He was first and foremost someone who wanted to be with people, who wanted to be close to people. And I think that's what we saw actually in recent weeks when he was released from hospital. Of course, the doctors prescribed a strict 2 months convalescence. Within days, he was being wheeled around St. Peter's Basilica with the oxygen tank behind him, greeting people, blessing children, wanting to be close to people, wanting to be near to people. And I think that's something that has marked his entire papacy. Wherever he went around the world, he always wanted to be with people, particularly people who he saw as marginalized. I mean, as recently as Holy Thursday, he visited the Regina Coeli prison in Rome. It had been his tradition up to this, when he was well enough, was to wash the feet of prisoners on Holy Thursday. Of course, in Dublin, one of the places he most wanted to go was the Capuchin Day Centre. Things like that always meant a lot more to Pope Francis than perhaps presiding at elaborate Vatican ceremonies.
Indeed. And Michael, how has he left the church?
Well, I would say he's left the church on a pathway. Pope Francis has started this discussion, what he's called synodality, this idea of walking together or taking co-responsibility for the church, lay people, priests, religious bishops, all working together under the authority of the Pope. Now, he was keen to point out that this is not democracy, that the church is not a democracy, and that people won't be asked to vote on core church teachings. They'll be remaining the same. But he has discerned, particularly in the Western world, that we live now in a very participatory society. We live in a society that is not as top-down as in previous generations, is not as hierarchical as previous generations, and people have an innate mistrust, if you like, for institutions that perhaps wasn't there in previous generations. And he sees this idea of synodality, this idea of working together in the church, regardless of rank, as the only credible way forward for the future. So that hasn't exactly bedded down. It is still very much a work in progress, and it'll be for his successor to decide now where exactly that goes. But I think if we were looking for one key achievement of the Francis papacy, synodality would be it, but it's very much a work in progress.
OK, well, we'll be discussing all of that over the course of this programme. Michael Kelly, former editor of the Irish Catholic, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Well, joining me now in studio, Father Kieran O'Mahony, Augustinian and scriptural scholar, Gina Menzies of the group We Are Church, and Joe Little, RT's former religious affairs correspondent. You're all very welcome this morning on what is a sad day, Kieran.
It is, of course, a sad day. It's not an unexpected day because, of course, he had been ill the last couple of years and then looked terrible yesterday, really. It's a day also, I think, for a kind of sense of gratitude. It was a life well lived and a ministry well lived. It's rare for us in our world today to get examples of genuine leadership when leaders are out for the good of those they serve. And that's really what we saw, genuine Christian leadership, marked, as was said by other people, by great humility. I mean, he did set aside the trappings of the papacy, which were kind of glorious, and you could easily lose the run of yourself with all this kind of honour and what we call plomos that would surround you, but he didn't. He kept himself grounded, and that's the meaning of the word humility, to be in the real world, and he was in the real world.
And famously, when he was elected, he insisted on returning to his boarding house himself and settling up the bill.
That's correct, in the Casa del Clero. There were some very funny stories at the time of his election. Another one was he was taken into what's called the Room of Tears beside the Sistine Chapel for putting on the papal gear, and they wanted to put something very glorious on him, and he's supposed to have said, "The carnival is over."
Gina, how do you think he will be remembered? What is his legacy?
Well, I agree with Kieran. I think what you saw with Francis was what you got. He was very much his own person. It just came to me today, like that famous, I think, Sinatra song, "I'll Do It My Way." And even yesterday, I mean, I think it was terribly sad seeing him so ill and so frail in St. Peter's Square. But I absolutely believe he wanted to be there. It was kind of, I think, like he wanted to say his goodbye. You know, he said his hello from the balcony and he said his goodbye. And I think it was wonderful that there were so many people there to acknowledge that. But you had to feel for him as a human being. He must have been feeling so ill. So at that level, I think, as Kieran said, also gratitude. He certainly has taken the church in a different direction. Many don't like it, but I think now it is irrevocable. It will not go back. He was very much the reformer who took on the legacy of Vatican II, which had really been parked, almost dumped, I would say, and has decided that this was the direction that the Spirit was calling the church to go in. And I think that will be his outstanding legacy.
But like the supertanker, it takes some time to
turn it around. Exactly. And there are still many issues, and, you know, particularly, I'm sure maybe we'll talk about women later on, but, you know, in many other directions, he wasn't afraid to confront the issues of the day. I mean, he really read the signs of the times, that famous phrase. He really saw the world as it was, and he saw the awful things in the world, you know, in relation to climate change, and he wasn't afraid to speak out. I think, as Kieran said, he was very much pastorally orientated. I don't quite agree with Michael Kelly saying that no doctrinal change. I think in his own way he has already brought about doctrinal changes.
OK. Joe, you were there, I think, when he was elected, were you?
Yes, I was, and there were a lot of raised eyebrows that night because that evening in the Vatican in 2013, it was springtime as well. People didn't recognise the name Bergoglio. He hadn't put himself about, you know, in terms of global church politics. He suffered badly from sciatica, so he didn't particularly like travelling to Rome. That sciatica was due to having some of his lung taken away because of illness as a young man. He was a mature vocation. He didn't go straight from school into the priesthood. He knocked about. He studied chemistry. He came from a working class background, supported a football team very passionately. He was an immigrant and very conscious that he was an immigrant.
Yeah,
and
his parents had fled Mussolini's Italy, I think, isn't that it?
That's right. And he knew what it was to be in a melting pot, because people think of Argentina as a developing country. It was a very, very wealthy 19th century, early 20th century economy. It sucked in a lot of migrants, especially from Ireland, we know that. The fifth largest Irish diaspora is in Argentina. So I think he was more than just a humble person. It was more pointed than that. He was anti-monarchical, what we call in these parts Republican.
In an institution, the Vatican, which is intensely monarchical.
Intensely monarchical and intensely Italian monarchical. Just in 1831, 54 of the 62 cardinals who elected the Pope were Italian. And only 50 showed up, and they were all Italian. So you get an idea of how immersed in Italian notions of monarchy, Roman notions of imperialism, the Catholic Church is. It's not just a supertanker you're trying to turn around. You're trying to excavate deep, deep, deep into the archaeology of modern culture and find a way of guiding a thread of what a church is really about, from the early apostles, disciples, up to the present time. He died as he lived. He said that the priests should know the smell of their sheep. His last day, he probably knew this was his last week in life. Doctors can tell you how long you've left. His last day was spent among the people. He has said that the church should act as a hospital outpost, a first aid post for the wounded. And that's why he took the metro out to the barrios in Buenos Aires. He didn't use an archbishop's car to go to the barrios because he wanted to experience the life lived by the people who were trying to get out of the barrios to do their business in the city and who were going back there in the evenings. Some of those barrios had no addresses. You know, they were built as shanty towns during a big industrial drive after the Second World War. So he was loved there. He used to cry about priests who he remembered with his people, older priests who had died and the work that they had done. And so he was Italian, Hispanic, Argentine in the very best sense. He wore his heart on his sleeve. And I think he enamored himself with people because of that.
And yesterday, I mean, significantly, he met J.D. Vance, with whom you would imagine he would not be on perhaps the closest of political terms. And he spoke about Gaza, as he has consistently since that conflict erupted.
Indeed, and J.D. Vance won't have missed that in the Pope's address about peace yesterday, he spoke about the need for freedom of expression to exist in order for peace to thrive. And that is a big concern among people, not just in North America, but throughout the world. People are having their iPhones checked about what they might have said to their friends about a local leader. There is a changed world, and that registered certainly with me as a pointed remark. It wouldn't have been a pointed remark to another American vice president, not in living memory anyway, but it was a pointed remark, I think, yesterday. So he was a man of our times who Irish people can identify with for many, many reasons. And his visit here, much more down low-key, of course, than the visit in 1979. I covered it too. I could contrast the two, but it was
a child.
I was first in my first year in journalism with RTE, but it was a very interesting experience because that was a monarchical tour by a pope who himself saw the signs of the times and realized that Soviet-inspired communism had to be overthrown and played a role in that. But this other man was a man for different times. Francis was a man for different times. And he has started discussions about women, about sexuality, gender, about the environment, as Gina has said, which cannot be closed down now. He has let the genie out of the bottle, and most of all about decision-making in the church being more flat, more democratic, not monarchic.
Kieran, synodality.
Of course, it's a word that is not a popular word, and people have struggled even pronouncing it.
Okay. How do I do it?
Synodical, synodality, and so on. It's a game changer, in my opinion, and it's based on two levels of very important experience for Pope Francis himself. First of all, his experience as a South American priest, bishop, because the South American bishops have been very forward in including people in their decision-making and discernment. And it matches then his Jesuit training of Ignatian discernment. And he realized that in the future, people expect to take part in decisions which are made about their lives. Everybody expects to take part in stuff, and we won't follow if we're not participants. And that's true, as I say to my clerical friends. Even the most conservative seminarian can't deny his modernity, that he will also want to be consulted. Everybody expects that, and I think it's a big game changer. And as the way Gina put it, there's no going back, and I think there is no going back. It isn't, of course, fully embedded. That's true here in Ireland. It's not equally embedded in all the dioceses, for instance. I think it's quite well embedded in Dublin, but not equally around the country.
And how does the church look if it does become embedded, and if this change that Francis set in train does reach its conclusion?
Then if that happens, then I think it'll be far more consultative, participative body. There'll be a high level of co-responsibility for what happens. And this is, in Ireland here, this is urgent. Because in Dublin, for instance, quite soon, there'll be lots of parishes with no priest in them. And somebody will have to care for the people. There'll have to be some sort of pastoral figures in there. And they'll have to work collaboratively with co-responsibility, with this prayerful discernment that Pope Francis initiated. And I think there's no real going back on that. Partly, first of all, it's based on experience in South America. It's based on the great tradition of Jesuit spirituality. It's been embedded in the teaching of the Church after the two assemblies in Rome. The final document, which is an unfortunate name, has been declared part of the ordinary teaching of the Church. And in that, for instance, it says, the admission of women to the diaconate is an open question, which is kind of an interesting sentence. And I think it's been owned by his team of leadership cardinals. And as you know, there's also a programme for the embedding of synodality until 2028. So I think what has started will not be stopped. There's no going back on this one. Well, he's done a marvellous thing. I was talking to Gina earlier. Vatican II was sort of, paused under two very powerful papacies. Pope Francis reignited Vatican II, and my image of it really is that the Church is a beached whale. And you can keep the beach whale alive by dousing it, but you really must get it back in the water. And I think he's got some of it back in the water. And I think he has changed the tone and I think the focus. For me personally, I think his focus on core gospel, the person of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the scriptures. I think the emphasis on mercy, which is a very wide application to people in Gaza, immigrants, very wide, LGBT, so on. And I think the emphasis on joy. And you know, all three of those are somewhat countercultural. People resist commitment to someone like Jesus. In the world in which we live, mercy is not that common really in government policy. And joy is a quality that's kind of missing in people's lives. So I think he put his finger on a couple of things that are really essential and uplifting and life-giving. And I'm grateful for his teaching and for the way he inhabited his role. So part of we'll pray for him, but it'll also be a prayer of real gratitude for what he did for us.
Yeah. Gina, we're a couple of nautical metaphors now. We've had a super tanker, and we now have the beached whale. But I mean, the point Kieran is making, and you made it, as there is no going back. It is part of the church now going forward.
Yeah, he has actually, it's like a map, and he has, made a map towards, and I think it's open-ended in that it's not quite clear where it will actually go. But I think the process of the journey, which is hugely biblical, as Kieran would know too well, is that, we journey together. And I think, the emphasis is on this notion of listening. He really told the bishops of the world, would you go and listen to what people are saying? What do they need in terms of a church that serves them? He actually, that notion of that, Joe said, monarchical, he believed in a church that was in service to people. That, I remember sort of studying, if you like, the scriptures. And one of the things that always stayed with me was that things that are repeated frequently are much more important than things that are just once or twice. And again, you can see in all his speak and all that he said and all that he did, there were things that were constantly emphasised, and listening and the role of the Spirit in relation to everybody. I think that was an astounding reversal of the past, where only clerics, if you like, who lived in the Vatican, discerned teaching and decided the rule of whatever. And I think he's now saying, well, actually, the Spirit, if we understand the Spirit, speaks actually to everybody, and everybody has some participation in that. And if we listen to the Spirit, you cannot but help go in a different direction. And I think that will be, a huge part of his legacy.
I agree. And I think he's done it really well. We used to think the Spirit speaks to the Pope a great deal, yes. To the next level quite
Cardinals,
a lot, yes. To priests somewhat, to people not at all.
Not at all, exactly.
And now he's really started this process of where does the Spirit want us to go as a community of faith? Yeah. And everybody is involved. And especially, he paid attention in the synodal process to minority voices. That was a very interesting feature in the synodal thing. It may well be that a single voice or two voices in the whole thing have put their finger on exactly what's needed. So pay attention to the people on the edges as well.
But there is a subversive, can I come in? There's a subversiveness in what he has done, in that he has called clericalism a cancer, especially in the Curia, in the civil service, central civil service of the Church. And it's, one of his biographers called him Francis among the wolves, Marco Politi of La Repubblica. And there is a job to be done over the next few weeks to preserve not just the legacy of Pope Francis, but to find a successor who will embrace that legacy and not be ambushed. Okay. There are a lot of people waiting in the long grass to settle scores after this pontificate.
Hold that thought, because we will come back to it. But now I want to go over and join former President Mary McAleese, who joins us on the line. Good morning, Dr. McAleese. Thanks indeed for joining us. How do you think Pope Francis will be remembered?
I think it'll take time to try and figure that. In this moment, the man who literally gave his last breath as Pope yesterday, I was watching him at the Mass yesterday and realised very quickly that he was not long for this world, and that he knew it. He was determined to die in the job and on the job. So one of his legacies probably derives directly from that, his fidelity to the job, his focus on and his determination to, if you like, stick it out, to be the man, rather like John Paul, who, no matter what came or went, no matter what the winds of change were, no matter what the existential crisis around him, he was going to live the job. live the role. And of course, what propelled him clearly was a sense of service to his priesthood, service to the papacy, service to the church, service to Christ. So that, in a nutshell, in many ways, is his legacy, is that legacy of service. But if you look at the two spheres in which he operated in two very separate spheres, clearly. The external sphere, the world at large, and the internal sphere of the church. Externally, much loved and had a lot to say politically as well as spiritually. We think of the work that he did immediately and coming into office and focusing on the tragedy of how immigrants were being treated and handled right across the world, but particularly in Europe. His fidelity to that, his going to the prison, his washing of the feet of prisoners, his constant reminding all of us of our responsibility to the poor, his determination in relation, for example, to ecumenical and interfaith relations. I think in particular of that extraordinary meeting that took place in Abu Dhabi. Was it in 2019 with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmad El-Tayeb, when they devised between them and signed off on that fraternal declaration. I think that, particularly since it wasn't just a declaration that lay gathering dust, but is actively being worked on now. Here are the two great religious traditions, two of the biggest religious traditions in the world, converging in terms of their principles and their values. So I think that the leaven of that will continue, hopefully, to be worked through and to raise all of us in hope over the coming years, particularly against a background of really rather toxic religious ignorance of one another. And of course, unfortunately, a world very often around the world at war over religious and political differences. So those are the kinds of things that I think in the external he'll be remembered for. Internally, it's a different story. We think of the remarkable opening up of the synod on synodality, and I think that again that's a leaven more than we can call it a legacy right now. It's a leaven that may rise. Or it could be, it could be killed off. The actual process from the day that he announced it through the diocesan discussions, through the continental phase, and then finally ending up in Rome was really rather disappointing. At the level of diocese, it was exciting. There were loads of discussions. He talked about an open agenda. He talked about nothing about us without us. But honestly, by the time it got to the synodal office in Rome, everything had been so heavily edited that the elephant became a mouse, became a whimper, and was rather disappointing, to put it mildly. On the other hand, he has left open that synodal door and said that synodality is to be the future of the church. So in other words, the debates are not over. He himself changed nothing in terms of magisterial teaching, absolutely nothing. Though he did respond. I think as Dermot Martin said about him this morning, he was a listener. Now, he didn't always listen to the right people, and that we can account sometimes for the flip-flopping on issues. But he did listen. And when he came into office, the church was faced with, and still is, faced particularly in the West, with an internal existential crisis. And he listened to those voices demanding reform. And insofar as he listened and allowed the debate to move, to develop, to happen, I think that is a great legacy. Now, unfortunately, there were mixed messages there too, because the German church was the first to really take on board his assertion that the future of the church would be synodality. He encouraged the church to become synodal, to involve everybody, nothing about us without us. And the German church did that in a very egalitarian way, and they'd no sooner started it than the very first reprimand they got was a very hostile reprimand from Francis himself. So there was that flipping and flopping that sometimes could be really quite infuriating. On the other hand, it happened. And because of the opening of doors and opening of windows, pretty much with doors and windows that John the 23rd had wanted open, but were nailed pretty firmly shut by Paul VI and John Paul II and Pope Benedict. Along comes Francis, and those doors and windows were being always pushed open by a very educated laity, and Francis knew that. And I think he responded to that, and that's his legacy, is letting those doors and windows open and let the air in, let the debate happen, and not be frightened that in a church of 1.4 billion people, there's going to be a lot of different opinions, and let the opinions, let them challenge one another. And through that process, particularly in always referencing the backdrop, which is the gospel and the great commandment to love one another, let's see where that leads.
And I suppose it depends to an extent, on what happens next and who comes next as to whether that will be allowed to continue or not. So this is quite an important turning point for the church, potentially.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, David. I think the next pope, the election of whoever is to be the next pope, will be absolutely critical, particularly to the church in the Western world, which, as I said, is faced with a massive existential crisis. Not in Asia, not in Africa. The church is growing exponentially there. Vocations are growing there, but vocations they've flatlined, haven't they, here in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe and in the Western world generally. So that's a massive problem. And the next pope inherits a really busy desk, a very, very busy desk. There are issues that Francis did not deal with. He didn't deal with the issue of women and diaconate and priesthood. He just didn't. He was old school in that regard. I don't think he could really bring himself to deal with that. He set up, as you know, there are 3 commissions, I think, now have examined the issue of women in the diaconate, and we don't know what their reports are. He took all the issue to do with women and priesthood. He took it off the synod agenda and sent it off to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, which is the kiss of death. Will never be heard of again, I'm pretty sure. So he was afraid of those issues and didn't quite know where to guide them, except that he did things that we were doing back in the 70s, or were being done back in the 70s, when the issue of women was coming onto the agenda. You'd have the token woman appointed here or there. And in that very tokenism, you would break, in a sense, old ways of thinking and old molds. So he appointed a few women here and there in the Curia. And so that, I suppose, broke a few molds, but it wasn't strategic. There was no plan. There was no analysis of what misogyny had done to this amazing institution, which is the Catholic Church. I mean, it is the biggest NGO in the world, bar none, the only faith system with permanent representative status at the United Nations, hugely influential across 5 continents. And with all that brain power, you would think he could have got a group together that would have investigated what misogyny had done to the church and what it was continuing to do as a kind of a braking mechanism. And also not just as a braking mechanism, but also as something that was turning people away and turning people off commitment to the church. So, yeah, it's a mixed, his legacy is mixed, but who knows? He did leave things that I would call more leaven than legacy. And they will perhaps evolve into legacy in time. And then whoever is the new pope, that's all on his desk to be done, to be dealt with. It's not going away. It's not going away. So let's hope for someone from that small group of men who are eligible to be pope, that someone will be found who matches what the future needs. The numbers are tiny. The possibilities are even tinier, but let's hope.
OK, there's plenty of food for thought there, and we'll explore some of that in a moment. But Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, this morning, massgoers at Galway Cathedral have been giving their reaction to the passing of Pope Francis and also the legacy that he leaves.
Despite the fact that we knew that he'd been ill for some time, you're never prepared for these moments. Even though it was probably anticipated and he made such a remarkable recovery. But what's so beautiful about it is that he gave his blessing yesterday, and I was so blessed to watch that on the screen and to get his last blessing, my son and I feel so touched about that he left with an Easter blessing and then a resurrection. What a moment that God chose for him to pass. It's just extraordinary, really. You couldn't make it up, you couldn't imagine it, you couldn't write it. But yeah, there is a great sense of loss and a sense of grief, and it's lovely to be able to come to the Eucharist now to offer it for him today. What more can we do?
You know, it's always a very sad moment when there's a change, and in terms of someone who's led the Catholic Church.
A life well lived, actually, and a great impact on humanity, right? Those are my thoughts, yes.
He looked all right when he saw him last on the telly, you know. God rest his soul.
And what kind of a legacy do you think he'll leave?
I think it's a good legacy. I think so. He was a good pope.
Oh, just sad news to hear it first thing this morning when I woke up. It was sad to hear it.
What kind of a legacy do you think the Pope will leave?
Well, I would always have considered him a good and passionate person especially towards the underprivileged and the poor. And also different, you know, he had a great outlook, I think, on the church.
We didn't expect it, really, you know, considering that he was out and about at Easter, you know. It's so sad, it's such a shock.
What did he mean to you?
Everything. Of course, yeah, of course. He was such a lovely man, you know. Yeah.
Humble?
Humble. Oh, humble, so humble from his background, you know. Yeah. Lovely man, Teresa, yes.
Mass goers in Galway Cathedral there speaking to our reporter Teresa Mannion. Gina, Mary McAleese was talking about the issue of women priests, and obviously that's something in which you have a strong interest. Francis came to the papacy with a reputation as a liberal. He was seen as a liberal, but on this issue, was he a disappointment, perhaps?
Well, I think maybe the kindest thing is to say that there's a work in progress. Mary did refer to there have been, I think, 3 submissions or 3 investigations of the notion of women being deacons. And to be honest, there isn't a single shred of evidence that would say that a woman couldn't be a deacon. And even further, going back, and I can't remember, Kieran might know it, there was a commission in relation to ordination. And that commission actually drew a kind of a blank in that it said there wasn't enough evidence to say that women could be ordained, but there wasn't enough evidence to say that they couldn't be ordained.
That was the Pontifical Biblical Commission.
I knew you'd know that better than I.
Which is quite hard to find, but I have a copy.
Right, yeah. Well, that's worth referencing now, because that was what it said. I have a sense in my own mind that when you look at the church and the notion of service and the need for ministry, that Francis has looked on ministry in a different way. Now, I might be wrong, but I think he's kind of deconstructing the ministry that we've had in the church. You know, the hierarchical one, as Kieran was saying, you know, Pope, Cardinal, bishops, etc. And I think he has kind of almost exploded that notion and talked about a ministry on the ground. I mean, my sense is that based on all the meetings and all the listenings and all the discernment, that his path and his sense of direction is towards a church of subsidiarity. And I think that word has just begun to sort of be mentioned, so that the church locally on the ground will make decisions that are relevant to the people on the ground. Because it seems impossible in the world today that you'd have somebody making decisions for people in Africa, in Asia,
if
in
they're
America.
In the Vatican City.
Yeah, in the Vatican City. It makes more sense that the people that the bishops, and I think the bishops have certainly, I don't want to be ultra critical, but I think they have let us down, and that they happily went along with that kind of model of church, and that they didn't try and have a participatory church. And I think what Francis is saying is that bishops now really do need to get their act together on the ground. And actually, just as a little aside to that, you might have noticed in the last week or so that in Killala, in Mayo, where they're way ahead of everything, they have just commissioned 62 lay people, men and women, to sort of be ministers in a very different way. Now, they're not ordained, but I've been to Killala and they have an institute there, and they're light years ahead of where the rest of the Catholic Church is going, and it's quite amazing. So the notion that on the ground you can have a local church, and I think really Francis' legacy is saying, these are the Gospels. this is what was talked about in the Gospels. This was Jesus' message. It was about the kingdom values, of, we said, of mercy, of love, of forgiveness, of peace, of justice, reconciliation. And he's saying, right, guys, that's where it's at. Go and implement that wherever you are.
Interestingly, Alva Keneally did a report on RT News last week on that commissioning of the pastoral workers in Killala, described the lay people who spoke to her as co-leaders. They're co-leaders when they are going to take a funeral with a priest. Not their acolytes, but their co-leaders. So that elevates the laity from being altar boys and altar girls to being, partly responsible for how that grieving family feels about their spiritual situation.
It will change things that as people experience it in a parish community directly.
But where he could have done a lot more as a centralising leader is in relation to clerical child abuse. And there has been a meltdown in the commission which he set up, and there were great hopes from the one that Mary Collins served on, in that the Jesuit who directed that commission has himself become disenchanted with how the Vatican has worked on this. And there were calls for, show up and do something within 12 months, or else a lot of people who supported that commission were thinking of just getting out of it. There's a problem with, as he has identified himself, clericalism. We should be judges in our own cases, is essentially the point that's made about clerics who are dealing with fellow clerics who have abused children or vulnerable adults. And nobody buys that, apart from people who live in dictatorships, that people should be judges in their own case. And our own station here is investigating what the Christian Brothers are doing on this. We're going to see a program on Wednesday. This is the fly in the ointment as regards rebuilding the church in Ireland. Is there credibility there? And elsewhere. Yeah. But I'm saying it in relation to Killala and in relation to the wider country. And I think that both of those movements, they illustrate the contradictions in that legacy, insofar as we know there is a legacy.
And that legacy, as Mary McAleese said, will be on the desk of whoever is the new pope.
It certainly will be. I think it's good to distinguish between being radical and being liberal. I think Pope Francis was radical in the sense of going to the heart of the gospel and putting it into practice. In terms of expanding how we include women in ministry, for instance, he was less liberal, but he was radical but not liberal. I think he has raised the profile of women within the church. He has given important positions to women in the Vatican, which puts women more visible. And I think it really isn't tokenism. He really does have a proper regard for what women bring to these roles. The legacy of women in ministry, of course, that'll have to continue to be discerned. The experience of other churches has been very wholesome. When I attend Church of Ireland services and I hear women presiding and preaching, I'm just jealous. Why can't we have these gifts as well? And it seems really strange to exclude slightly more than half of the people present in any church on a Sunday, but 70% of people in church are women. It seems extraordinary to deny yourself this range of gifts. And of course, there's no contradiction with Christian tradition. If you developed the doctrine of order, so to speak, to include women, well, God the Creator, the Saviour, the Trinity, everything stays in place. The core stuff, justice, ecology, all of that, but you have suddenly this wonderful enrichment.
I think to a great extent, particularly in Ireland, we're a very unscriptural community. I know Kieran works with that all the time, but I think
it was regarded as a Protestant thing to be
exactly,
scriptural.
And I suppose that was sort of the revelation of reading the Gospels and suddenly realising that Jesus was accompanied by a multitude of women. Well, multitude is but by many women in many parts of it. And recently, I was actually in Milan and saw the famous fresco of Leonardo da Vinci, which I think has been embedded in our mind. I mean, it's magnificent art in that, he said to the apostles at the images that someone is going to betray me. And like the significant thing about that was all the hands and the expressions of the apostles. But I think that was not kind of an accurate description. And so just an aside to that, I subsequently went to a wonderful art gallery full of Renaissance art that was magnificent. And I've often said when people are discussing it that the Last Supper was a reflection of the Passover, where of course there were women and of course there were children. And I often used to say kind of little as an aside, and cats and dogs. And I am now standing in front of a magnificent picture of the Last Supper by a 16th century Italian painter. And there are women and there are children. And the hairs in the back of my neck stood up because there was a cat and a kitten and a dog. So I think, we've had images that are inauthentic. For example, and the other one, like Mary Magdalene, there's not a single line of scripture that said she was a prostitute. And yet, what have most of us grown up with the notion of Magdalene Laundries, the fallen woman?
Exactly, yeah. Now, thank you, Gina. You're staying with us, but Joe and Karen, thank you so much for being with us. It is just past midday. If you're joining us, you're watching this news special on the death of Pope Francis, which was announced this morning. We can look now at some scenes from the Vatican. On behalf of the Vatican, Cardinal Kevin Farrell announced that the Pope had returned to the house of the Father. He was 88. He had been seriously ill in recent months with pneumonia. Just yesterday, he made a brief public appearance in St. Peter's Square to mark Easter Sunday. President Higgins spoke of his presentation of the papacy with a unique humility of how he sought to show in the most striking and moving of ways the extraordinary importance of how he of the spiritual as a powerful source of global ethics in the challenges of contemporary life. Taoiseach Micheál Martin said he had shown an unwavering commitment to the principles of compassion, peace and human dignity. Taoiseach Sir Simon Harris said he was a remarkable figure who embodied compassion, humility and service, while Sinn Féin leader Mary Lou McDonald said he was a courageous spiritual leader, a man of strong conviction who stood up for those most marginalised and vulnerable. Well, Pope Francis visited Ireland in August 2018 as part of the World Meeting of Families. During his two-day visit, the Pontiff met the President and the Taoiseach, visited Knock Shrine and celebrated Mass at the Papal Cross in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. Our correspondent Mark O'Driscoll looks back on his visit here.
It was the first visit by a reigning pontiff to Ireland since 1979. But for Pope Francis, it wasn't his first time here. As a priest, he had come to study English in Dublin in 1980. His first visit as Pope followed an invitation to attend the World Meeting of Families in Dublin in 2018, so it was classed as a pastoral visit instead of an official state one. However, his first stop after being welcomed at Dublin Airport was still Áras an Uachtaráin, where he had a private meeting with President Michael D. Higgins before travelling to Dublin Castle, where he was met by then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar.
I want to greet you using one of the oldest blessings that we use to welcome a special guest, Céad Míle Fáilte.
His warm welcome was followed by a reminder of what Mr. Varadkar said was a shared history of sorrow and shame.
Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools, illegal adoptions and clerical child abuse are stains on our state, our society and also the Church.
The Pope addressed the Church's handling of clerical child sex abuse in his response.
The failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests and others adequately to address these repellent crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remain a source of pain and shame for the Catholic community.
Clerical child sex abuse was an issue which would be a reoccurring theme on his two-day visit. Pope Francis did meet privately with some survivors of abuse, and he went to the Pro-Cathedral, where he sat in silent prayer at the Candle of Innocence, a perpetually lit candle for the victims of clerical sex abuse. While protests were a reminder of this and other deeply felt issues, there were also scenes of joy as people lined the streets to see the Pontiff in his Popemobile in Dublin city centre.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, we're going to see the Pope.
So we just took our hands, said a prayer, and I just started crying with my nerves and everything. It was just amazing, amazing. Yeah, wasn't it?
I was crying. I was starstruck.
You were starstruck?
Yeah, it was so amazing.
So we grabbed Rocco with his both hands by the face and kissed him on the forehead.
And what does that mean to you?
Everything. Because when Rocco was so sick, that's all we kind of had was faith. So for the Pope, the actual Pope, to kiss Rocco was like amazing.
The Pope spent some time at the Capuchin Day Centre, and day one concluded at one of the key events of his visit, the Festival of Families gathering in Croke Park. Described as a musical celebration of family, the organisers said it was to remind people about those who are struggling, particularly migrants and refugees. Among the high-profile acts entertaining the tens of thousands of people at the event, Andrea Bocelli and Daniel O'Donnell, while 500 school children from across Ireland joined in a special performance of Riverdance. The second day of his visit saw Pope Francis arrive at Ireland West Airport, where among those to greet him were Western bishops and a large group of school children. The weather wasn't kind, but it didn't stop around 45,000 people gathering at Knock Shrine to wait for his arrival. Many were there since the early hours.
We're here since 2 o'clock. We landed over here at 2 o'clock. It's raining heavy the whole time.
It's great for our Monsignor Horan up in heaven there to finally get his wish to come true for the Pope to land in Knock. So
it was lovely seeing him. Yeah.
You're overcome.
Yeah.
After private prayer in the Apparition Chapel, Pope Francis took to a specially constructed stage and spoke about the importance of family prayer, reconciliation in the north, and again the issue of clerical abuse.
None of us can fail to be moved by the stories of young people who suffered abuse, were robbed of their innocence, and left scarred.
Back at Knock Airport for his flight back to Dublin, the Pope was asked to sign a Mayo jersey, the pontiff's signature still not enough to break the so-called curse in the intervening years. On his return to Dublin, the Pope's final public engagement was in Phoenix Park to celebrate a papal mass, the high point of his short trip to Ireland. 500,000 tickets had been circulated in advance, but far fewer turned up to the mass, where the Pope acknowledged the pain and damage caused by a church hierarchy who had sought to cover up abuses, and he asked for forgiveness.
In a special way, we ask forgiveness for all the abuses committed in various types of institutions run by religious men and women and other members of the Church. And we also ask forgiveness for all the cases of labour exploitation to which so many young people were subjected.
It was a short trip. Pope Francis was in Ireland for just 32 hours. After a final meeting with Irish bishops, he waved goodbye before boarding his plane home. Mark O'Driscoll, RTE News.
Well, I'm joined in studio by former Archbishop of Dublin, Dr. Dermot Martin. Good afternoon, as it now is. Thank you very much for joining us. Just watching those images of Pope Francis' visit to Ireland, what are your memories of that time?
I have memories, a number of memories about that visit. As we were just watching there, his final comments about child abuse. He met a group of survivors in the nunciature on the previous evening. And half an hour later, he came to Croke Park. And in the basements of Croke Park, he called me and he said, I've completely rewritten my introduction to the Mass tomorrow, after what he'd seen. And he said a thing which has struck in my mind. He said, people told you that to seek your mother and father, if you were been in a mother and child home, was a mortal sin. And he said, it wasn't a mortal sin, it was the fourth commandment. Love your, and this was very typical of the way in which many of his spontaneous, automatic responses were typical of the man himself, you know. And in the end of when he met the bishops, the final, there's a phrase there where he said, I want you to remember that your church has a history of being an authoritarian, harsh church. Now, one of the problems with that visit was he only spoke in Italian or Spanish. And we've no radio or television clips of him saying something in English that could be used. So many of the things he said on that occasion were are forgotten. You know, everybody can remember young people of Ireland, I love you. But there was no phrase that you'd get them like that saying it in English or in Irish, which was the... But again, just around that particular period, there are two things. When he met President Higgins the last time, he said on camera, he said, I've just met not just a president, but a prophet. He was very impressed. But one other thing, which I've never said in public, that was 3 times after I met Pope Francis in different places. On one occasion, he actually called me back. And he said, I want you, when you go back home, to give my special regards and thoughtfulness to the man who was the Prime Minister in Dublin when I was there. That's Leo Varadkar. I've never asked him to explain what it was. But there was obviously, you know, he had this memory, whatever happened there, there was some sort of bonding. And that was one of his great talents, his ability to reach out to people, rather than simply the official role that he had as Pope. You know, there are 2 other examples I always use. One was this man who had a facial deformity, and he was at the audience, and the Pope was driving around, and he stopped the car and got out and went over to him. And he didn't say to the person who was accompanying him what happened to him. He kissed him. He kissed the man with the, you know. And I had another friend who was brought up at the end of an audience, and when she was being presented, the man who was there said, this lady has a very troubled son. And he didn't say, well, what's his problem? He said, what's his name? And at the end, when he asked people to, he always said, please pray for me. And he turned to that woman and he said, I'll always remember this boy with his name, which he remembered. So this is, I've been trying to think today, what made up the man rather than the Pope? And there was this, he was, you know, I don't excuse using the word stubborn. He was determined. And that was one of the ways he was able to, I'm not going to go into how many things he did and did successfully, but what drove him? What drove him was his being a man of God, but a man of the real God, not the harsh, judgmental God that dominated much of our thoughts. But he always said, the name of God is mercy. And I think that drove him in a lot of the things that he did.
The visit, I mean, obviously there was comparisons drawn with John Paul's visit in 1979. Joe Little was referring to that earlier. I mean, they were very, very different events, I suppose.
They're different times. I mean, I when speaking to him about the preparation, I said, look, I explained to him what had happened. You know, 1979, I wasn't here, I was living abroad. But I said, it's a changed Ireland. And he was well aware of that fact. I mean, to the fact that he would have addressed the abuses. And he said, not just sexual abuse, but abuse of power and abuse of emotions of people. But it was a very different world. I insisted that he go to the parish in Sean McDermott Street, because on the previous visit of Pope John Paul, people gathered there and the Pope just drove by, and there was a sense of hurt there. And with a lot of difficulty, you know, he decided he'd go, but he just stopped there. But immediately he said to me, I want to talk to the people. And this was his first meeting with people in Ireland, and the managers were not happy that he was spending more than the allotted time, you know.
Well, it's important to keep to schedule, but I get the impression that if Pope Francis wanted to do something, he was going to do it.
Yeah, but that was one of his. He was a free man, and that was extremely important in his ability to. You know, he could say very strong things as well. He wasn't afraid to say sort. You know, I don't know what he said to Vice President Vance, you know, but I know his meetings with President Trump weren't the warmest of meetings that he's had. You know, but he Santa Marta was a place where he lived. You know, he had a group of transvestite prostitutes who came to him regularly, you know, and these are the ones that the news seeped out. But we've no idea the number of, and that is the one, for me. I keep asking me, who was this man? He's also, there are two things I say. The Pro Cathedral in Dublin is the only cathedral in Ireland that has ever visited by a pope. And that, again, I'd helped in that. The other thing is, he's the only pope who ever lived in Ireland. He lived a number of months.
Learning English, was it, or studying theology?
It came at a particular moment when he had been ousted from his position as provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina. And it wasn't the happiest moment in his life. I asked the Jesuits, the only record they can find was that he asked for 10 shillings. Remember the old red 10-shilling notes, to buy a book for his English, and he didn't repay it.
Did you ask for it back?
I didn't know. But, I mean, I asked him a little bit about that. He was a few months. He didn't normally talk about it. He could remember one or two names of the people who were there, but it was a difficult period. But it's interesting, we should remember that he wasn't just in Dublin for 36 hours as Pope. He lived a few months in Ireland.
OK, we're also joined by Father Alan Hilliard of City Quay in Dublin. You're very welcome. Thanks indeed for joining us. Now, you have an interesting connection with the late Pope Francis with Lampedusa.
Yeah, Lampedusa was an interesting event. It sort of outlined his policy approach, which was to do what he wanted to do, as Archbishop Barton was saying, quite stubborn. And the normal protocol when a Pope is elected is to go around and visit the various different cardinals around Italy. And when he was advised, he said, I want to go to Lampedusa. And sort of people were saying, oh no, you can't really do that. But the story goes that he was trying to book his own flight to Lampedusa. And
just to explain to people, this is the island where a lot of migrants were arriving into.
Yes, at that time. He said, my people are dying. That's why I want to be there, when he was asked. My people are dying. And he went down to the island, and he wasn't going to have Mass because so many of the population were Muslim, but the local community wanted Mass. And he celebrated Mass with a chalice made from a migrant boat. And the man who made that chalice made one for me, which I use in the parish every day. And it was made from the frustration of that carpenter seeing people die. And I think, Pope Francis brought the frustrations of the world to the altar every day, the pains of the world, the torment of the world. So, but he really sort of marked the card of the people who were advising, I'm going to do it my way.
Yeah. Now, hold that thought, because I think we're joined from Knock Shrine by Father Richard Gibbons, the rector there at Knock. Good afternoon, Father Gibbons. Thanks indeed for joining us. And I suppose we were just talking about Pope Francis's visit to Ireland. What are your memories of that?
Good afternoon, David. It was an extraordinary time. It was a short visit, but we were so delighted and so very happy that he visited Knock Shrine in 2018. We had a very short window to organise everything. We were notified in March, and he was coming in August. So it was frenetic. But we remember when he did come that it was such a wonderful occasion, despite the weather. He was happy. He seemed light-hearted. He engaged in conversation. I asked him, was he ever in Knock before? He said no. Then I explained a little bit about the apparition. And then he came into the apparition chapel. And at that particular time, a bell rang to denote a moment's silence in prayer. And you could have heard a pin drop. There were 40,000 people outside, not a word, not a noise. And that was an extremely special moment for everybody that we experienced. Then I had the honour of presenting him to my mother, who was there, confined to a wheelchair, and he asked what was wrong with her, what the matter with her was. I told him, and she was in her 70s then, and he said, too young to be ill. So it was a lovely personal moment. And then he spoke to the crowd, 40,000, and left directly afterwards then. And we were very honoured and delighted with the visit. And we're also very happy the fact that he elevated the shrine to international status in 2021, which was a huge honour for us.
And you mentioned that personal touch, and a lot of people have spoken about that, about his approach to his pastoral duties, that he really did try and communicate directly with people.
He did, absolutely, yeah. He had that particular ability to link into the personal. And I suppose that came from his pastoral outreach in Argentina and Buenos Aires, and from the reputation that he had in terms of connection with the poor and those that were sort of cast aside by society. That shone through. And, it was like just speaking to another pilgrim that came to the shrine. And in fact, with the elevation of the shrine to international status, he made that point in the dedication, that the shrine should always be open to everybody, willing to accept the pilgrim, even those of whose faith may not be very, very strong, to those that are strong, and that's what we strive to do in Knock all of the time.
Okay, Father Gibbons, I know you have business to attend to, but thank you indeed for taking the time to speak to us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Archbishop Martin, that reference to Pope Francis's background, to his pastoral work and his work in the church in Argentina, I mean, that really did shape him and shape his views, didn't it?
I mean, he was the Jesuit provincial at a very young age, and he admits himself that he made many mistakes on that occasion, that he was considered maybe authoritarian, but he had the ability to recognise mistakes and to change them. And then he became first of all auxiliary bishop, then he became the archbishop. When he was made a cardinal, he gave strict instructions that people were not to come. He got his clothes made from adapted the clothes of his predecessor, and he began, going out to the poorer parishes, and had a sort of an alliance with priests who worked in those areas. One of the key factors in his election was when they before the election, the cardinals meet for about 2 weeks, day by day, and he on the final day gave a little speech, and he said what he thought the next pope should be, and it was all about going out to the peripheries. And by peripheries, he didn't just mean geographical peripheries. He meant anybody who was on the margins, and that was very much at the centre of his heart. But behind all of that was, as I keep coming back to say, was his idea of who God is and what our God is like. Our God is not a harsh, judgmental person. God is mercy, who's there, and his task is to bring God's mercy so that people... I mean, the Gospel of 2 Sundays ago here was about the woman caught in adultery, where they want to stone that woman. And he says, who hasn't got a sin, let him cast the first stone, and they all go away. But the interesting thing about that story was the end of it. You had this woman who was a sort of a symbol of human misery, who becomes herself. She's standing there in front of the God of mercy and is able to go back to her own people as, I am now a woman, I have got my own dignity, despite all my failings, that God's mercy heals. Now, I keep asking myself, was the Irish Church, or is the Irish Church, is the Church, is that the message? Is that the message of God, of a merciful God? And that was the essence of everything he did. And it wasn't just, I keep asking myself today, what made him that way? And what he was saying, you could make judgments as to whether he was successful in this or that political or church political question. But there was something he brought about us, all of us trying to understand what God is really like. And I have to ask myself now, was he successful at that, or was he not? Am I successful in being a Christian? Or is the Christian church present in today's world a presence which reflects that merciful God? And I think we all have to ask questions of ourselves.
Mm. And Gina, is that the question really perhaps that people might reflect on today as they think back on Pope Francis' legacy?
I think they will see somebody who lived the gospel according to his lights and his insights. And I think, as Dermot said, he learned hugely from his experience in Argentina, which was not comfortable by any means. But the fact that he learned from experience, I think he took that into the rest of his life. And I think that's what made him the person that he was. I mean, he was a spiritual leader, but he also was hugely political, because you cannot be the head of the Roman Catholic Church with 1.4 billion and not have a political position. But he tried to integrate that, I think, into his sense of spirituality as well. And I think, you know, that is his legacy. I think that insofar as the disappointment is, the changes, the reforms have been quite slow for many of us, particularly in the Western world. I think he really wants the Church to take on, to be a different model. And I think in that model, you know, it will be, as people have said earlier on, it'll be a declericalised church, where the laity, particularly women, will have a much stronger role. And I think ultimately we will have women deacons. I think I've no doubt about that. And probably in time women ordained. But I don't think the ordination issue is a big issue for many women, but I think the big issue is ministry. How does a church minister in service to the world, which is urgently, this toxic world in so many ways, is so urgently in need of a gospel? I think his kind of, to me, I would look at it, he's trying to apply the gospel to the world and to the culture, and it is going to be different in different places. That's why I go back to my kind of concept of subsidiarity. It will be different in South Africa than in North America. And I think, you know, particularly I think the church in North America has hugely let us down at the moment.
OK, Alan Hilliard, Gina mentioned the toxicity of the world at the moment, and Pope Francis was very small p political, perhaps, in issues like, I mean, he spoke, we were saying he spoke yesterday about Gaza. He kept in constant touch with the Christian church in Gaza, and he spoke about the environment in a very strong way.
Yeah. In actual fact, he's given away Casa Gandolfo to set up a borgo, a village, a sustainable village, as an example to the world of what can be done. Because, see, a lot of people talk about migration, the problems with migrants. He actually believed that if you fix the problem of migration, you fix the problem of poverty. In Argentina, he was out and where the poor people were gathering in the dumps, collecting food to live on. And he saw why people were leaving. So he had a much bigger vision than just the migrants who are arriving on shores. He wants a world that everybody has enough to live on. In actual fact, we've lost sense of what the biblical imperative is, which he has, which we're here to flourish. We're here to flourish as human beings. We're here to flourish as societies. And the world is going in such a way now, less and less people are allowed to flourish. And he wanted people to flourish. And that's the idea he had behind the whole migration thing, is the dignity of each and every person. The first principle in the document written by the American bishops and Mexican bishops about migration, the first principle in it is the right not to migrate. We forget that. Like in Ireland here, people didn't have that right. They had to migrate. And in places where people are living, there was a young lad arriving in Lampedusa, 22 years of age. Every night when he got a Wi-Fi, he read the Pope's message on Facebook. He said, because he left because he witnessed a murder and had to get out of the country. He says, I am not on my own, he said. That's what Pope Francis means, I'm not on my own. And that man was a young Muslim.
A Muslim?
Yeah.
And that message had reached across to him? OK. Now, just to catch up on some reaction to the news of Pope Francis' death, politicians at home and abroad have been giving their reaction to the Pope's passing this morning in the Vatican. Taoiseach Micheál Martin said the Catholic Church had lost an exceptional leader and sent deepest sympathies to all who were mourning his passing. The Taoiseach said he learned with deep sadness of Pope Francis' death, saying he was a remarkable person who embodied compassion, humility and service. President Macron of France also expressed condolences and said he and his wife were sending their thoughts to all Catholics and to a grieving world. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the world was mourning Pope Francis. She said his humility and love for the poor inspired millions. While US Vice President J.D. Vance, who met the Pope at the weekend, said his heart went out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. Well, in the hours after he was elected Pope in March 2013, Francis asked those gathered in St. Peter's Square to pray for him in what he called a prayer of the people. That set the tone for papacy, which would go on to focus on simplicity, humility and synodality. But there was also considerable criticism for failures around progressing issues like women priests and ongoing concerns around child protection. Fiona Mitchell looks back now at his papacy and the legacy Pope Francis leaves behind.
Unprecedented and many initially thought unworkable, The circumstances of Pope Francis' election had already sent shockwaves through the global church. Two popes with differing views and approaches, sharing space in the smallest country in the world, was a test which proved for many an indicator of Pope Francis' personality and skills.
I think the remarkable thing that Cardinal Bergoglio, Pope Francis, brought to the papacy was he had a very strong sense of himself. He knew what he was about. He knew what he wanted to do with the papacy. He knew what he wanted to bring to it. So, in fact, far from seeing Benedict living in the Vatican as an obstacle, he saw it as a tool, in a sense, he could use. He developed a very close and warm friendship with Pope Benedict, which I think surprised some people because, you know, they're really coming from a radically different viewpoint of the Church. Benedict said on numerous interviews that he felt very protected by Pope Francis. And yet, at the same time, Francis was able to chart a very different way forward. We associate with the papacy of Benedict, you know, with regal vestments and a kind of formality that Pope Francis very, very quickly set aside. Right from the beginning, we saw he was wearing the black scuffed shoes rather than the red leather loafers that we'd been used to with Pope Benedict, setting aside the more traditional, more elaborate vestments to say, I'm setting a tone of simplicity here. And I think the important thing about the simplicity, that was not something rehearsed. This is just who he was.
Those differences were seen not just in a less formal approach, but also in the priorities which Pope Francis identified for his papacy.
He really wanted to focus on what he called the poor church for the poor. So I think certainly his attention towards the poor, the marginalized, migrants, any of the exploited, and also, he really made a big focal point of his papacy as well, the issue of climate change. He really wanted to make sure that this was an issue that people were paying attention to, not just for the sake of, creation itself and sort of the Christian call to care for the goods, in the earth that God gave us, right? But also because it directly affects the poor.
Alongside the Pope's social concerns were questions of church reforms on issues ranging from homosexuality to women priests. For much of his papacy, Pope Francis was caught between the worries of conservative Catholics who feared that reforms were moving too fast and the disappointment of liberal Catholics who feared that reforms were not moving fast enough.
The only predictable thing about Pope Francis is that he was often unpredictable, and he was a bit of a maverick to everybody, to, what people would call his own camp, maybe the more progressive camp in the Catholic Church that he was associated with, and the conservative camp. And I think Francis is somebody that did not fit into either of those molds. His pastoral approach, for example, to issues such as communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, he didn't offer a blanket open door, but he opened the door.
Some of the harshest criticism of Pope Francis surrounded his handling of the ongoing issue of clerical abuse.
He wasn't slow to, critique and denounce clerical abuse itself. I think he was slow to understand the nature of the cover-up, to understand the institutional forces that were at play. I think in the Vatican, the lack of transparency around these issues, the lack of authority given to the various committees and commissions that were set up to deal with the issue of clerical abuse, I think he slowed that down in a sense, not by any deliberate action or desire to slow it down, but I suppose not approaching it with the earnestness that I suppose had been necessary and had been adopted by his predecessor, Benedict XVI, and understanding that for the credibility of the Church, never mind the needs and the rights of children to live a life free from abuse, but for the credibility of the Church to speak in Western society, that it had to be seen to be acting on this issue. So the issue of clerical abuse remains an issue that his successor and probably successors after that will have to deal with.
That successor will be chosen in the Vatican in the weeks ahead. Fiona Mitchell, RTE News.
Fiona Mitchell there with a look at the legacy of Pope Francis, who died this morning. Still joining me in studio, Diarmuid Martin, former Archbishop of Dublin, Gina Menzies of the group We Are Church, and Father Alan Hilliard of City Key in Dublin. Archbishop Martin, you spoke earlier about Francis being a free man.
Yeah.
How free can anybody be in the Vatican in that position?
Well, he can be free to try and do the things he wants to do and to let it be known what things he wants to do. And Alan gave the example of his desire to go to visit Lampedusa in the beginning, and everybody said no. If he wanted to do something, one of the big problems is that the church in many parts of the Western world is particularly divided. The United States Church, there are some very, very conservative elements there. To replace the episcopate in the United States by people of his own view isn't an easy thing, because it takes time to replace people. But he has actually dismissed a number of bishops because of their very conservative views, and also because of their lack of reaching out to address the question of child sexual abuse. I said there earlier that I was very impressed by, when he was here in Ireland, the strong way in which he spoke about abuse, in something that he wrote immediately after meeting the abuse victims and the survivors in Dublin. But I mean, to put it this way, if he wasn't a free man, he would have been able to do nothing. But because of the fact that he had this, today I'm just constantly asking myself, what made him, what gave him that ability that he has to be free, and I saw that on a number of occasions myself, just talking to him. But it was his fundamental view of who God is. And that God is not this harsh person that we made him out to be, but that he's a God of mercy, and that if all of us as individuals and as Christian communities could learn from that and have the freedom to stand up and to get out and do something about it, I think the church would be much stronger.
And Alan, you were mentioning hope was another theme of his, and it was the subject, I think, of his last document.
It was, yes. Hope does not disappoint, and he was a man who brought hope to many. And it's a beautiful document, and there's a display of it through the churches in Dublin, linked with this Jubilee year from Western Road, starting on Western Road to City Quay to Sean McDermott Street to the Pro Cathedral. But in the Pro Cathedral part, the latter part of the document, he talks about death like I've never heard it talked about before. Like a lot of Christian things, we fudge around the ultimate mystery. He gets right into it. He says, what is death? It is communion. What is communion? It is happiness. So he had no fear of death. And in actual fact, the Stations of the Cross in the Colosseum last Friday, and maybe I'm to be corrected in this, but I'm nearly sure he wrote them from the hospital bed. Incredible. If you want an insight into this man's soul, because Archbishop Dermot was talking about, what is this man? He was a deeply spiritual man. When he was in Ireland, after that he went to Germany, he discovered a statue called Our Lady of Knots. And he prayed to untie the knots in himself. He was a complex man then. He was a hurt man. He was a pained man. He used his faith to deepen his sense of who he was as a human being. And that comes alive in this document, Pockets of Hope, which we have on display. So even this week, if people want to get to know the mind of the man, the soul of the man, I'd recommend taking a quiet journey on that little pilgrimage.
OK, and that's in churches around
It starts in Western Road, City Quay, Sean McDermott Street, and the Pro Cathedral.
OK, get the steps up as well.
Yes.
Gino, Archbishop Martin has spoken about him as being a free man. Paddy is talking, Alan has talked about hope and all this sort of thing. And do you think he was happy in the papacy? Do you think he wanted to be Pope, or did he feel called to it?
Well, I think the stories are that he probably didn't want to be Pope, that he had bought a return ticket back to Argentina, which would suggest that, you know, he wasn't prepared to stay there. And I think it was quite a shock to him. But I think because of his own deep spirituality, he accepted, if you like, the task that was ahead of him. And, you know, he lived it as thoroughly as he could. I think a lot of, you know, what's the commentary about him, you know, being absolutely compassionate, but I also think there was a steel underneath him. I think he realised, I actually now am in a position where I can do things. And I think there was a steel in his soul and in his heart. And I think he did go his own way. I think, at the beginning I said, I'll do it my way. I think he very definitely did. And even at the end, the fact that he very openly, going back to what Hayden said about his illness, he had no difficulty in talking about his illness or letting people know what was happening to him. So he almost showed us, a way to be ill and a way to have a terrible illness and a way to die. So I think what you saw was a man who lived his spirituality and his belief in every fibre of his being. Interesting, Untying the Knots. The first book I read about him was called Untying the Knots, and I think that is what he was trying to do in terms of the Catholic Church. There are a lot of knots. I think he untied many of them, and I think there were more to be untied. And I think in time I would be of the hopeful variety that things will come to pass.
I actually went to see that painting, the original. It's a painting, but again, this freedom that he had. When he became Pope, in all the emotions and so on, when they produced the vestments he was going to wear, he said no. They produced the red shoes, and he said, these are special shoes I have to wear. So from the very beginning, he could show that, just in the way he lived, he could give an example.
I was just going to say, one of the other, I think, significant things to say before we end is that he certainly didn't judge people. He never judged anybody. And very interestingly, in the past history of the two previous popes, I think over 100 theologians had been silenced. He silenced nobody. I wished he had brought back the Irish theologians who were silent and the Irish priests who were silent, but that may have happened in time.
Okay. Well, one of the things he was interviewed very early on. And the interviewer said, who are you exactly? And he said, I'm a sinner. And you could see on the face of the interviewer, that's what popes have to say. And then he came back, no, he said, I want to say that I'm a sinner. And the message he was giving there is somebody who sets out with the conviction that he himself is a sinner, a weak man, a man who makes mistakes. He's not going to judge other people. If you have this idea that I have my weaknesses, I have my faults, I'm prepared to admit them, that changes your attitude to other people.
OK, well, we'll leave it, that beautiful thought. We'll leave it there. Dermot Martin, former Archbishop of Dublin, thank you so much for joining us. Gina Menzies of We Are Church and Father Alan Hilliard of City Key in Dublin. Thank you all for joining us. And that is all we have in this news special. Thanks to our guests. Karen Creed will be here with an extended 1 o'clock news, but we leave you with these reactions to the death of Pope Francis from massgoers at Armagh Cathedral, seat of the Catholic Primate of all Ireland. Good afternoon.
Seen him on TV and social media yesterday out and meeting the people, and he seems so determined, I'd say, to get home from hospital, be amongst his people and go at the time that he felt was right for him. That's just, we feel sad. We've signed the book of condolence inside the cathedral. There's a calmness or something in there, isn't there?
There is, yeah. So we're sorry to hear about the Pope passing away. He was a very humble man. That was his strength, was his humility, really. That's what I felt about the man, yeah. So he'll be a loss to the Catholic Church and to the people of the world.
5 up-and-coming garden designers take on 5 similar gardens with the same budget.
I believe in the no-dig method of gardening. Screw.
Can't get carried away here now.
I'm tired already and we're only starting now.
But who will get to showcase their talent at Bloom?
If I was in your shoes, I'd be worried.
Do we see this as a contender to win Super Garden?
Definitely.
A new series of Super Garden.